So we're live, and I'm here with Blaise, author of An Unconventional Biotech. I've got my, on the call today, we have around 50% of the people from Boston and sort of the US in general, and half from the UK. So I think it's one of the first ones where we're roughly 50-50. And we have, over 100 people on. So I think we should get some good questions as well. I'm going to try to guide the conversation slightly. I don't have, because it's such a big US presence today, I mean, the Brits can kind of handle my alcoholic beverages, but I wasn't sure how well that will go down at 10 a.m. in Boston. So I've got my chai, my genuine tea today, and there's no whiskey in it or nothing whatsoever. It's completely tea and coffee oriented. So I'm going to, I basically known Blaise for a number of years, and I've met him quite a few times in Boston. And I saw that he'd written this book, and I thought it'd be a brilliant thing. I've never done a book review like this before, so I thought I'd enjoy doing this. And what better topic and subject to do than an unconventional biotech is? It's probably something I spend most of my life thinking about and working with our companies to do as well. So on that note, I want to welcome Blaise to our 7th Chai Time this lockdown. I think we're going to have a good series. We're planning on doing 10, by the way, in this block. Have you got a copy of your book there, Blaise? I thought I'd just show you your book.
I do, yes.
So this is the book.
This is the, let's see,
and so I see that, the artwork on your book was actually done, I presume, by your wife, Nicole.
My daughter, actually.
Oh, is it your daughter?
It's my daughter, yes. My daughter is the artist.
Okay, so she's actually on this call, I think, as well. She did register, at least.
Okay.
So, Nicole, we like your artwork. It's very nice.
Yeah. So some inspiration from our CEO, Praveen, has become a comic drawer, and so
I've noticed.
Yes.
I've noticed on LinkedIn he'd be in a meeting and say, "This is my impression of this meeting." It'll be something quite comical. He's quite an artist, actually.
Yeah. Always looking for something a little bit different, which fit throughout the company's formation as well.
So to kick things off, I think it's a good thing to find out a little bit about the author and about you. There's not much mention of you personally in your book, and I did actually read the book cover to cover this week. But I didn't have a real copy of it, so I was reading it from a Word document manuscript. I actually read it really quick. It was a great read, by the way. It was a thrilling read. I enjoyed it because it's about everything I think about, and I'm sure most of the people on this call would do as well, from day to day. And there's a lot of sort of smiley moments in there, and so I do recommend people do have a look at the book. But I'm going to find out a little bit more about you. You're a medicinal chemist by training. Perhaps you can go into a bit of your background and your family.
Okay, sure. Yeah. So thanks for inviting me, Sunil. Really looking forward to this. This is the first leg of the book tour, as it were. I'm sure you get that often, maybe not. Really excited to be here. It's the book is. It was, to be honest, it was originally an idea of my CEO to look into this and to sort of try to chart. Initially it was around chemistry and the idea of what we did well, but trying to loop in then what I thought was the most interesting story is the founding of the company and going from in between jobs as well. But personally though, so I was born in Michigan and outside of Detroit, went to college in University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and then got my PhD in chemistry at Stanford. So I worked for Paul Wender there. And then I think part of what made the journey interesting is I've been at all sizes of companies. So I went from school right into big pharma. So that's really where I was trained. I feel like that's, especially as a medicinal chemist, that's really where I learned almost everything. And then went to a mid-sized company, Cubist. At the time, I don't think I would have been ready to jump to a tiny company like Morphic. But went to a mid-sized, they made antibiotics. They had a profitable drug on the market, but really only one. Then that was bought by Merck. I was laid off. And so a lot of that's sort of where the book begins is, being in between and then thinking of what to do next. But just to finish personally, so I've been married to my wife Nicole, as you mentioned, for a number of years, and have 3 kids now, and all living at home now with the current situation. But
So,
as in high
so
school.
I did ask Blaze if he could play the piano. I think like me, his kids are learning, and probably like mine, they've probably given up. And then you end up with a big piano in your house, which actually I think it's a grand piano. Actually, it's very nice. So,
It's a baby grand. It was from my parents. They
okay.
downsized and didn't have room for it. So at least I didn't buy it. But
Yeah,
yeah,
most
we're at the phase now where all 3 kids are sort of into it, and I am not. So I was really hoping you wouldn't ask me to play something.
And what are your hobbies, Blaze? What do you like doing sport-wise and otherwise?
Yeah, I mean, my favorite sport is skiing. So in the winter, so I was just about to go on a big trip to Colorado in March when this all hit. So
that might not happen. Maybe next March, but
I was 1 week too late.
So yeah. So in terms of the title of the book, you've called it An Unconventional Biotech, and to most people in the UK, it seems very conventional that you start with an idea in the USA, in Boston, and then you go through the Boston machinery and end up with $1 billion listed biotech company. For me, that's kind of one after the other. So why unconventional?
Why unconventional? Yeah. So it's a lot of it came from how we set it up. And I think a lot of it goes back to, I mentioned our CEO, Praveen. And I mean, there's a story, for instance, early on when we were, Praveen and I were recruited sort of in parallel. We actually both came from Cubist and knew each other, but we didn't know we were both being recruited at the same time. And there's this one meeting early on with him as well as Albert, who was really the first employee, who was a postdoc in the founder's lab, where Praveen tells us, I've for the last decade, I've been listing all the problems with companies run into, and we should fix them all at the beginning because they're hard to fix at the end. And the first 2 things on the list were no PowerPoint and no email. And that sort of set the stage for some of the things of, we're not just going to do things the way everyone else does it, or because consultants told us to do it a certain way, but we're really going to think deeply about what makes sense.
Yeah.
And build it that way.
Now, you mentioned that in your book. I thought it was quite interesting. And
yeah.
I mean, the science is, and we'll go a little bit into it, so to explain a little bit, but it was founded or based on work done by Tim Springer. And he's a very well-known professor and academic, both from his own academic point of view, but also in commercializing his technologies. So the question I have really is, how important was his recognition and brand name, apart from obviously the science that he brought to the table, how important was his recognition in getting things moving and started in the very beginning? And maybe you want to give a little bit of background to Integrins and the role that it plays. It's a mixed bunch on the call. There are some very good scientists with deep knowledge, and some who are interested in the area may not have such deep knowledge. So you may want to balance
Sure.
If you talk about the science.
Yeah, it might make sense with that that initial pitch you'll hear going into, if you're thinking about a new job and somebody calls you, whether it be a headhunter or a venture capitalist or something, and so that in a nutshell, the pitch was around. So integrins are a class of there's 24 different ones. It's a class of receptors, and there's been both success and failure. So there's been several drugs that have put on the market. And then there was a time when people tried to have oral versions of some of those early drugs, and they all failed, and they actually made mortality worse. We used to draw it's called the Gartner hype cycle, where there was a time in the 90s when lots of people worked on integrins and there was lots of experience, and then after they all failed, there was this valley of despair where everyone wanted to stay away from them. There were too many failures, and so the idea was that Tim had this new technology around the conformations of integrins, and that he'd spent the last decade in academia studying what went wrong and understood it, whereas big pharma or industry would just get out because they don't have the time to do that. And so he had a new approach to this established class where you felt like there was a path forward. And since there was some validation there too, in particular for Tysabri was approved for multiple sclerosis. Vedolizumab had just been approved for inflammatory bowel disease. So you could see where there was some biological validation, a new approach, and more than one target too, which is nice with a small company where you're not just on, because if the one target could feel fairly binary, it's either going to work or it's not going to work, but there are a few options in there. But you asked about Tim. So Tim has this really interesting background because I was used to professors that were very famous, and I mentioned the books. They often have very big egos as well, and it's well deserved. But they haven't always been in industry, and they don't always know what it's like in industry or some of the things you go through to try to get a drug. Whereas Tim had previously founded Leukocyte, and this was a number of years ago, but it was very successful, eventually bought by Millennium. I think all of Millennium's drugs actually derived through something in Leukocyte. He had
so he had that exposure to the commercial side as well as the academic side of science. So he kind of was able to, I mean, he seeded it. I think you wrote in the book that he did actually seed
half the seed too. So he had previously a couple of years earlier formed a company called Scholar Rock, and then had this idea for this company. So he put up half the money as well. But he was one of the first discoverers of the class. He had this success in industry before. So he was well sought after by venture capital people, as well as seeding half the money helped.
Yeah. So I guess coming back to my original question, how much did his brand name help with subsequent rounds and selling the science? A lot of what you're doing is, you're there to execute on the projects and to ensure that you run a proper drug discovery process. But then Praveen, et cetera, and probably yourself as well, had to go out and sell the science to raise the further funding, et cetera. So how important do you think that is?
Yeah. So it was quite important. And I'd always, and this was really my first experience, at least directly being in a small company. And I would always tell people it felt a lot different than what I expected, because I expected, and I know people that have had the idea on their own, but they're not famous, and they always struggle for money, and they're in some basement with lots of cinder blocks. And in our case, I mean, not just Tim, but having a good venture company, which was Polaris Partners at the time, seeding it just always felt like we had plenty of backing, that even if we think we stumbled a little bit at the beginning, they had plenty of extra money they would help us out with. And then with Tim's brand name as being, a famous professor and also a successful entrepreneur, it helped enormously.
Yeah.
And you'd say for the Series A, that was pretty much the story, because it was too early to have much data of our own. It was really about the team and the people involved.
So quite early on in your book, in the first chapter, you talk a little bit, you give a bit of background to why biotech, and you give some of the history around that. And the chapter is called "Discover New Drugs, Biotech is Best," which is music to my ears, and obviously, and you do play out in terms of where academia plays its role, where biotech plays its role, and then where pharma can jump in. So maybe you can give a summary of what your thoughts on why you think biotech is best.
Sure. Yeah. And it's been sort of a career long journey for me, at least, I guess it's been 20 years now, sort of time flies. But I really started in big pharma and was a big believer in big pharma. And I feel like it is a great place to start your career in general, because you just learn so much about your trade. And there's just such a long history of, in my case, medicinal chemistry at these places. And so many, senior people that know what they're doing. Though, I would then, after I was there for a while, I'd start questioning, why don't we have more drugs? Because it felt like we had the most talented scientists and the most resources. And I think, many people have gone through these same thoughts. And obviously pharma always is trying to optimize and change. But I think it's harder, I think, the early stages of discovery, where it's so dynamic and you're not even always sure which therapeutic area you might end up in. And within pharma, there's just so many different groups, and it's hard not to become at least somewhat siloed and bureaucratic, that it just moves slower, I think. And I think at that early stage of discovery, you just really need to be very nimble and flexible and and then plus you're really all in. You know if this fails, everyone might be looking for another job in a few months.
And maybe you can talk a little bit about the risk appetite for some of these things when you're a biotech. It's like, it felt, when I'm looking at this, it's like, if this doesn't work, basically, we're done, or there's very little for us room to maneuver. But in a big pharma, there's lots of other options to do other things. And so you really have to like think and live and breathe your technology, because that's all you've got essentially.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that the job side of it has evolved a lot. I'm probably in England as well as in the US, but because I was in the Connecticut site of Pfizer, which is fairly isolated. I mean, it's not far from Boston, but it's fairly isolated. There's really no other jobs there. And, I entered in late 99 at the time when many people had worked there for 30 plus years. It felt very stable. You knew Pfizer was going to be around forever, and it felt like a good place to be. Whereas a small company, you worry about the risk all the time. But it's really evolved that, especially if you're in a biotech cluster like Boston and I think Cambridge in the UK is becoming as well. Even if it doesn't work out, there's other jobs to go to. So it's not quite as, and in some ways it's less risky than big pharma, because in big pharma, sometimes every year, every 2 years, certainly at Pfizer for a while, there was another layoff, and you didn't know it was coming, and all of a sudden it would hit and morale would go down. So in many ways, I actually like the
I mean,
biotech.
Just you mentioned the ecosystem and when you were looking to set up, you would have thought typically West Coast, San Francisco, home of biotech. But to most of us known on the call, there may be some who may not know, but Boston is really the hub. And how important was that ecosystem around you in starting a biotech? We're often talking about that ecosystem in Cambridge, how we can emulate some of what you've got there in our own little area. So how important was that in helping you build?
Yeah, it's become very important, and it was a consideration too when I was looking for a job coming out of Cubist, when Merck had bought us, where I didn't really want to consider a job in a remote location, because if it doesn't work out, you're probably moving back to Boston or San Francisco for that matter. But I think with the ecosystem you have a lot of good universities. There's a lot of new graduates all the time. A lot of the venture capitalists are here. You can walk down the street and see people. There's a lot of expertise that's already here. So, particularly in Cambridge, at least before the current situation, you'll see old colleagues at cafes, and for non-confidential kind of advice, you can sort of strike up conversations. And there's that plus academics and everything else. Now on the downside, Cambridge in the U.S. at least has reached the point where the rents are astronomical. The traffic, at least, used to be awful. There's such a competition for talent too, where there is a point where it does introduce some challenges as well. But
I think what's happening in Cambridge, I mean, for people, we have obviously a great university here. We have that really strong scientific base and a really quite large cluster of biotech. And we've got AstraZeneca here as well, another big pharma through acquisitions have moved into the area. We have the same traffic issues and problems, but I think where the ecosystem kicks in a little bit is like, I'm at the school gate and I suddenly see, someone quite senior in a big pharma or someone in another biotech you start talking about, oh, your kids, and oh, by the way, what about that and that? And then I feel like, actually, if I was doing this all the time, and I kept bumping into people I know off the record, as it were, you'd get a lot of business done. You share ideas because a lot of it's about trust and working together. And I think you get that when you're able to work with people outside of a meeting, Zoom, face-to-face environment. We're actually talking about other things as well. And I think that's where the cluster really kicks in. Obviously, through that, it's sort of grown and grown and grown. And the second area, I think, is the experience of executive management in Boston is second to none, because many people have been through it second, third times. And I'll come on to sort of the reasons why it may be, because you said you got laid off from Cubist. You said that in your introduction. And, but they're a public listed company and the stock price had done well. I presume you were okay at the end of that. Many people would have said, I've tried hard, I've done okay. I'm quite happy, spent some time with the children for 5-10 years. And I'll see where that goes. And there's a lot of people that actually do that, but you decided to go into the frying pan. What was your motivation behind that?
Yeah, and first of all, I didn't do quite that well. Certainly not for 5 to 10 years. But yeah, it was it was the first time I had been laid off, and for the history, Merck bought the whole company and laid off the whole division, so I didn't have any choice. But some career changes are are forced upon you, and oftentimes they end up being good. I mean, I would see that. I think one of the worst things that can happen to you is plateauing in a job where you're somewhat comfortable but not growing and maybe not that happy. But it's hard to make that break and move, and take on a new risk or a new challenge. And sometimes it's almost better if it happens, even if it's a little bit of a negative short-term aberration. It's almost always better in the long term. But because I could have taken, I mean, sometimes I look back and wish I took maybe a few months off but you never know when the next job will come or when the opportunity will come. So I was actually somewhat worried about it. It was the first time, and, lovely family to take care of that's still fairly young. And, I would hear, especially if you take off more than 6 months, then maybe people start wondering why you didn't find a job yet, kind of thing. So I really got right back into it. And then I partly, and yes, more small company too. I mean, the Cubist experience was so good, and when I started, it was relatively small, certainly versus a lot of companies. And then part of it was with Merck taking over, and there were a few months of overlap there, where it sort of reminded me that I didn't want to go to a big company again. Just culture, it was so different. And I think it was ironic because a lot of people at Cubist probably, just to avoid that short-term uncertainty, would have taken a job at Merck and probably would have been much less happy for it, but then broke out.
You talk about in the next chapter around, and I visited you here when you were in when you're AZ campus at the Waltham campus, and you talk about the thing about the fobs, and maybe you could relay that story actually, because it's quite. Most of us, a lot of us on this call would probably have been through that AZ hub at some point, or some of us, and met those security guards. And I can just imagine you having this conversation with them. But maybe you want to just relay that story about in the early days when you had to get the new fobs. Yeah.
Yeah. So and I had mentioned I've actually been to the Alderley Park AZ site as well, which is actually, it's remarkably looks almost identical, although there's more companies and it's a bigger site. But just being a small company, especially at the very beginning stage, I think there were about 6 of us or something like that. And, it's just so dynamic. You're just talking to people and moving around all the time. And then it's our first day in our new labs, and, everyone's excited, and you're plunged right into a 4-hour training of, where the exits are, and, what,
Yeah.
it was a reminder of being in big pharma, where, you'd have all day classes and you feel like maybe you got an hour of like solid, worthwhile information out of it. But you wish it was much shorter. And even to the point that the story I tell in the book is that we had 10 offices, and one of them didn't have a key. They forgot to give us a key. So I thought, we'll just go down and get the key. And
yeah,
there was like a 20-minute discussion that ensued around whether or not they'd have to fill out a form or what they could do.
I can just imagine that happening.
Yeah.
So you've got your space, you've got going, and then you have to find a chief scientist, a CSO essentially, and they've asked you to recruit your boss.
Mm-hmm.
And you talk about having to do that, and it's probably it brings a smile to my face when I read this chapter, because you probably won't have to think about doing that or ask someone to do that at some point. But interestingly, you decided to recruit a CSO chemist and not a biologist, and that's quite unconventional for most biotech. So maybe you can talk about why you decided to have a medicinal chemist head up the scientific charge.
And part of that goes back to Praveen, actually, because I can remember the recruiter telling him it is something like 80% of CSOs are biologists, and he immediately thought, well, if only 20% are chemists, I'll probably get a much better chemist than I'd ever get a biologist. There'll just be less competition, And he always had the sense of going to where things were less tapped, and so that was his leaning right from the beginning. And we looked at a couple biologists, but it was mostly focused on the chemists. But yeah, hiring your own boss, I don't, how many people on the call have had to do that or not, but it is very stressful. I actually had to do that once at Cubist too, and we ultimately failed to do it. We didn't find anyone on the outside we could agree on, and then our senior person just picked somebody. So actually that can sometimes be worse. So, it's good and bad. But I was, as far as being a chemist though, I was aware of at least 3 stories where the chemistry CSO ultimately fired the head of chemistry at other companies. And I think it's not that uncommon because.
Yeah, that's not cool if you recruit your own boss and then he fires you. That's really bad news.
That's right. That's what I was hoping not to do. So far, so good. But I think what can happen is that if the CSO knows the science so well that if they think, if you have a different approach or a different philosophy, sometimes it just doesn't work out.
On that point though, I mean, sometimes the science you're doing is new. It's kind of, you're going into new areas and evolving something that's already there. But you need someone who can really champion what you do, and you've got to find someone who really believes in what you do. So even if, you've got to be careful, and as you sort of alluded to that, to have real champions of the science when you recruit your CSO. And I thought that was a really important point in recruiting your CSO. I think it's Bruce, isn't it, the CSO?
Yeah, Bruce Rogers, who's been great. And I think in hiring in general, I mean, I've found where sometimes that middle, like somebody like Bruce, who had a lot of potential, had moved up a lot, but this was the next level up. It was a new experience for him. And I think oftentimes that can be the best fit because they're really motivated, and they're really trying hard and they have all that potential, and so I think oftentimes that can be best. I mean, it's hard to generalize fully, but sometimes people that are very senior that have already done it for a long time aren't quite as excited about it.
I'm sure there's lots of funny stories about putting more than one medicinal chemist in a room and trying to discuss it. So how did you did you have any interesting discussions around the direction of the chemistry?
Yeah, I mean, so one thing that I think made it easier is we were both from Pfizer. So we knew each other. We had never worked in the same group before, but we were both sort of trained with the same philosophies in mind. So that was never really an issue, because I mean, for the chemists on the call, I mean, there can be, in terms of structural alerts or how big your molecules should be or shouldn't be kind of thing, there can be very strongly held beliefs among around how to do things like this. So a number of those things were an issue, but I think one of the things he did well was trying to stay fairly hands off. I mean, giving advice and asking a lot of questions. And I think, I think good managers do that, and maybe that's how they do it. Is they ask leading questions, but they don't always seem too leading, and maybe oftentimes it goes the way they might want, but you think it's your idea too.
I'm looking up at the question Q&A as well, and please do fire in questions as well. I've got obviously a long list, and but if I see things which that you want to ask Blaise, I'll happily ask them. And Simon makes a good point about it's not just about Cambridge. If the UK, I'm sure, because there's a lot of people from the UK that to really to really punch above its weight, we need to combine forces with Oxford, London, and other areas in the UK as well. I mean, one of our startups is from Nottingham, so there's good science in all corners of the UK.
I visited Oxford, and you have the triangle there, London, Cambridge, Oxford. There's a lot of potential there.
And hopefully they're going to connect up much, with the train line at some point, and it'll be easier to get around. But I'm going to move into sort of the meat of your story, and you talk a little bit about. I mean, some of your investors was a CRO essentially, and you talk about choosing the right chemistry partner. I obviously have to ask you a little bit about this because we do have obviously a fairly large chemistry group in India ourselves. But how important, in general terms, is it to have a good CRO, and what are your thoughts in picking the right partner?
Yeah, I think that's critical. Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned them taking part in the venture round, because Schrodinger, who's on the computational chemistry side, really did that too. And for a small company, that may have multiple options, it sort of sets it up going in one direction or another from an early phase. So I can see the value in doing that, and then they can also pay in just services instead of money in many cases as well. But I think the newer way of doing it, and I'm sure it's the same in in England, is to be mostly virtual. I mean, we have labs which we have liked it, particularly for a lot of biology experiments and some chemistry, but more and more you can outsource so much, and then it's so flexible. Many times it's lower cost, and really critical to have those relationships.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, and I think the way it all feeds into each other is something that we saw, which is why we've evolved O2H. We have obviously the chemistry or the drug discovery service is O2H Discovery, but then we have the venture part, which is very, very small and focused on the UK and the way it's structured. And then we have the incubator, again in Cambridge, which we're developing to house some of these startups, because like Boston, the price of lab space is going through the roof, and it's happening in the UK too. We're not probably even 10% of where you are probably, but we're definitely going that way. So
yeah. But yeah, and visiting the CROs often. I try to do a virtual visit now. I'm not sure what you're doing now, but we would go twice a year, hand out awards. Try to make the folks on the teams and the CROs feel a little bit more like the company, present on the company.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah. Yeah, I think from the CRO side, to actively engage with your collaborators is really important, to feel like you're one team, because you are doing a good chunk of the innovation and the heavy lifting of the science. So it is definitely a team effort. You mentioned Schrödinger as a partner, and a lot of some of our small investments that we make in the UK are around technology to either expand the science or validate biological targets. And you've got people who really believe in tech and really believe that you can use computational firepower to speed up the drug discovery process, and some people who still want to do it more the traditional way. You talk a little bit about using Schrödinger and how it helped you. Maybe do you want to expand on that?
Sure. Yeah. So the company really was set up from the beginning as Tim brought the structural biology piece. So we had crystal structures that showed how molecules would bind and lock in this sort of closed and activated form. So that was one of the key technologies early on. And the thought was to leverage that with Schrödinger to then take those crystal structures and model it, and then to in their case, their technology, their largest technology has been FEP. It's called free energy perturbation. So essentially to really predict the potency de novo of molecules that you would make. And that's been very effective throughout. It's been a great collaboration. They've really given us pretty much anything we've wanted. It hasn't been the type of collaboration where they look at the contract and see what it says and doesn't say. I mean, they really wanted to help us succeed at every stage, and felt like they were part of the company throughout.
I think they're a good group.
Yeah, and more recently trying to use machine learning kind of things as well.
Yeah.
Both for potency as well as things like PK. And the idea is it's been fairly symbiotic, I think, as well, because then we try out all their software, they sort of learn what works and doesn't work. And I mean, they had a recent IPO as well, where they have some of their own projects now, no integrins. There's always a separation. But they've tried to become a drug company themselves.
No, I mean, I think the tech companies in this space are going to evolve quickly. I think we're still quite early on, but some of the technologies that we've seen, I think, can really help and support the drug discovery process. And you don't have to it's such an expensive and long process, as you've got to be able to use computational firepower to shorten that process, get to your optimized molecule more quickly, or validate a drug target. So they're the two areas that we look at least. But Schrödinger, I think, have got the model bang on right in terms of investing and supporting. There's a little funny story, not really, but Praveen mentions about how he compares intravenous drugs of going to the dentist. I thought maybe you want to relay that little story.
Oh, sure. So I mean, I don't have it verbatim here, but one of most of the value probably of our company results around having an oral version of Entyvio or vedolizumab, which is for Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, inflammatory bowel disease, and but the IV drug works pretty well. And so sometimes people would say, well, why do you need an oral? And oftentimes it's young people, and it's maybe only a monthly injection, but it's like going to the dentist every month kind of thing, where young people don't want to have to do that. It's much easier to just take a pill. much preferable.
I'm going to ask one question really about more about before we get into the IPO, which I'm sure, and the business development deals, which obviously I want to make sure we have time for that. But there's, you talk about whether to use your money in the early stages to create more in vivo data around particular programs, or really to do more sort of biology validation. It's a discussion we constantly have, and we always think people with more money would be doing more biology, and that's how you create more value. But we only have enough money in our smaller UK biotechs generally to do, the studies that you really need to take it forward. So, I mean, you talk a little bit about that dilemma.
Yeah, that was a huge debate early on in the company because some of our investors, including our lead partner, had said we need to prove that this closed inactive form that I've mentioned of the integrin is better. The problem was it was so early on in the company, we didn't necessarily have the best tools to do it, at least not in the integrins and disease areas we cared about. And so we were stuck with this dilemma of, do we try anyway with poor tools, and really they'd prefer to do it in vivo, by the way, and the error bars are going to be huge, or we could do it with better tools, but in the disease area and an integrin we don't care about. And I think it would have been a big distraction to do it. And luckily we were able to convince them, and one of the partners at Polaris, Amir, I think saw it this way, that we really needed to believe in the technology and work in the direction towards the drug and the diseases we cared about. And then once we got better tools, then we would show it, but that it wasn't critical at that early phase. All of us were very relieved at that, because it could have taken us, and we could have ended up with an answer with poor tools that would have ended the company at that stage.
Yeah. So I have other questions in between, but I don't want to run out of time without going to the punchline in a way. So, but you did a very large deal with AbbVie, and maybe you could talk about how you got to that deal, and how much of the deal numbers you can reveal.
Okay. Yeah. So it's sort of remarkable, because the original design of the company from a business development standpoint from Praveen was that we would hold on to this IBD asset, because since the biology was validated, the thought was at the end of phase 1, that would be a huge value inflection point, because once we showed that the compound was safe, good PK, and we were hitting the receptor, it should be a drug. Was the thought. So we should hold on to that, because that's an early point and potentially a massive market. The other assets were in fibrosis. And we knew that was a longer clinical path, expensive, higher risk. And so the thought was always to partner some of those assets. And so once we approached a development candidate, we started talking to a lot of companies. AbbVie entered in our Series A. So they sort of had a firsthand look at it that helped create a lot of relationships as well. And
it's a whopping upfront payment from a pharma. I mean, do you think that's kind of typical, or why do they pay such a thumping amount?
I mean, it helped. It was competitive.
I can't remember if the number's public or not, or did I read it or not? But if you want to,
the upfront was
pretty what it was. $100 million.
Yeah,
So,
as part an RS1, I'm sure it was in there.
But,
yeah.
So that's a whopping amount of money, 100 million upfront for a fairly early stage program in a way. Why did they pay $100 million upfront?
Yeah, so it was very competitive. So there were a number of other pharmas that were interested. That helped a lot, and it was a 3-target deal. So I think that's partly how it's justified. So it's sort of spread out of 3 targets.
And were you forced to spend that money on your programs, or was that kind of money you could use for developing the whole company in the framework?
Yeah, so we weren't forced to spend it on the projects, although they don't reimburse our costs on those projects. So in reality, a lot of that money would go to those projects. But I think in our case, I think we had really good looking molecules. When you do these third-party reviews with chemists that look at the structures and look at all the data, there were really no concerns. And I think just overall, there was just a very positive view from
and is that 100 million like a down payment or an option on future acquisition rights, or?
So that was just the upfront. So there are other milestones and royalties as well. The biobucks, as it's called, gets much larger. I don't think all of those numbers are public, but
Yeah,
Uh,
and then
yeah,
you also did a deal with Janssen, and we
yeah.
found them to be a really good partner as well in the early stage. So how did that deal come about? Why did you bring on a second farm? And actually, was the
Yeah.
Janssen deal pre-IPO or post-IPO?
It was pre-IPO, yeah. So
Right.
the Janssen one. So Janssen was interested in the first deal as well. All these deals too. They're helped by having connections at different levels of the organization. I'm sure no surprise for people like you in this area. But there were a number of connections there. They liked us. They wanted to do a deal with us. And in that case, it was a very early stage deal. So these were targets that we hadn't worked on before. And this was part of the idea of the company as well, that so they do reimburse all of our expenses on those targets. And small companies often reach a phase where development becomes much more important and expensive. And so the thought was having a deal like this too would help pay for discovery, regardless of what bumps we could hit or wouldn't hit in the future. That was part of the idea there. And then pre-IPO too, for the validation. Both deals, I think, gave us a lot of validation.
And did you then have to raise further money pre-IPO, or did that money kind of carry you through to an IPO?
That carried us through. Yeah. So we had done a seed, a Series A, a Series B. The Series B was about a year before the IPO, and then the IPO. Yeah.
So talk us through the IPO story and the highs and lows of going on to NASDAQ.
Yeah. I think it was all exciting. I mean, it was, you don't know for sure.
Did you ring the bell? Did you ring the bell?
I was there. Praveen ring the bell. That's sort of where, the book ends at, more of a high point of the IPO is getting there. But yeah, I mean, it's, meeting with a lot of investors, and all of our insiders were in as well, but you're trying. The S1 is something that gets put out for NASDAQ, a few months in advance. Lots of detail on the company. I joke that I was a level below where they didn't have to reveal my salary and the number of stock options I had and all that, but people above, they reveal everything.
They work out how much you're worth, and right.
Oh yeah.
In a way, if you didn't have NASDAQ there, if you didn't have a good market to IPO, where would you have gone with this company? Would you think you would just continue to grow it? Do you think one of the pharma would have bought you out? Because you in the US, you're very lucky you have that market there. We in the UK have nothing like that whatsoever. So we have we have to see where we go with our biotechs, whether we go for an acquisition essentially, or some of them do flip into the US. But where would you have gone with it otherwise?
Yeah, I think right from the beginning of the company, you sort of keep multiple options open. We were actually formed as an LLC, so each project was a sub company where it with that thought in mind that if somebody wanted to buy one of the projects, they could more easily. So we always had, I think, many options open. And I mean, even with NASDAQ, there's been times in the past where the IPO window is really closed. I mean, people were worried that would happen now, though, but for whatever reason, it hasn't happened. But so I think, there were always the options that you referred to. I don't know that there was another public market to go for. It would have probably been the scenarios you listed, trying to stay private longer, trying to sell assets, trying to sell the whole company, something like that.
Did any of the big pharma you were partnered with ever try to acquire you? Because that would seem a very natural thing to do if some of those bigger milestones have to get paid.
I mean, I don't think it ever, like, at least in these early phases in the book, I don't think it ever really came up. I think it's hard for the investors to justify a price that pharma would be willing to pay. I don't know that the economics ever line up because we're hoping that first IBD drug is a multi-billion-dollar drug kind of thing and results in a massive payout. I think that the investors often aren't looking for a 2x payout or something like that. Yeah.
So it's a natural way for you to go. And, the stock price reached over $1 billion at one point as a biotech within 4 years of pretty much starting up.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, it's sort of aspirational. We're certainly not there yet. Although
I think this morning about 650 million at the moment. You crossed $1 billion. I think you're at 650 at the moment, or 700 or so.
Yeah, a little over 700, I think. So it's I always like that the $1 billion molecule book. So I like that title, but it's certainly more.
But you did touch it, so it was a good title.
Yeah. For those who've never gone through this, you can't sell any stock for 6 months, and so at the point when I think we went out at 15, there was a point when we were 33, you know, and you can't do anything about it. You're sort of looking at this price, you know, skyrocket, and then ultimately went back down to 13 and then at 20, and it's one of these other dynamics. But we try not to focus on the stock price at all. You try to focus on advancing the science and the company, and the rest will follow, you know, but that is a challenge.
And where to next for you? I mean, you know, having been a medicinal chemist in a small, big, and, you know, come through the whole machinery of doing an IPO. I mean, you're obviously someone who likes challenges. That's probably, I guess, why you've written a book about your experiences. Where next for you?
Yeah. So, I mean, I like the arc my career has taken. I mean, I don't think I would do anything over. I like starting in big pharma, but I like being in small companies now. So I can't see myself exiting the small company phase, you know, at least not in anytime soon. So I mean, for me, I mean, for me personally, I think it's about larger scope. I've more recently, I'm much more involved with structural biology and screening biology, and taking a bigger scope in my role, and moving in that direction. But
so I have some questions about where people can buy your book from. Do you want to just show the book again and
sure,
let people know where they can buy the book from?
Yeah, it's part of the book tour, right? So yeah, so this is the book. It's not usually backwards. So it's just on Amazon. So you can just search either my name or the title on Amazon, and it's bargain price of $10. It's not, you know, it's funny. It took a while to write, but it's not that thick. It's a it's a pretty good read. It wouldn't take that long, and
I think for most of us in this space in the game, it's a very nice read. It's an easy read. I'm sure it'll bring smiles to your face when you sort of relay stories that you've been through yourself, and it's a good sort of, you know, succinct learning of how to really do it.
Yeah.
I would call it the conventional way, but I like the title. So, but look, if there's anything else, I think we've covered all the questions. And is there anything else you want to add, Blaise? It's been really great chatting with you on your book. I think it's you know, it's amazing the journey you've been on, and for you then to write it up in such a nice way. It's been a great chai time. It's a privilege for me to interview you. So thank you for that, and thank you for coming on today. Is there anything you'd like to add before we wrap up?
No, I think we covered it all. I mean, and I think, you know, on that topic of the book, I mean, I think, you know, having never gone through it before, when I started this journey, the book sort of helps you. I mean, I, you know, wish maybe that I could have read something like that at the time to understand it, you know, if you ever make that jump, because it's certainly different. But thanks a lot for hosting me. I really enjoyed it, and you should definitely continue this past 10. I think a great idea. Yeah.
So Chai Time number is 8 next week. We have an oncology theme to it. I've got a really strong panel again. I really enjoy doing them actually, but it does take quite a bit of effort to put the panels together. And but it's a lot of fun for me, I have to admit, and for other people in O2H. It's not just me that supports it; it's other people in their team who help me put it together. But it's great fun, and I really appreciate you coming on. Thank you very much, and I hope you have a good weekend.
Okay, thank you. Have a great afternoon.
Cheers. Bye.
Okay, bye.